Fate sometimes arrives disguised as debt. Michael Santos held the reins of the bay horse with more force than necessary. The animal felt the tension and shook his head, restless. The dry Arizona wind carried the smell of sage and parched earth, but it couldn't take away the weight Michel felt in his chest. 28 years of life and now this. The parents' farm had been lost in the game. The debts were many. And the only way out the family found was this: an arranged marriage to Martha Hensley, a widow for 3 years, owner of one of the largest farms in the county. The sun was high when he spotted the house. It was bigger than I imagined. 2 dark wood gables, a wide balcony that went around the entire front, and a garden that someone took care of with care. It was not the home of a woman abandoned by luck. It was the home of someone who knew the value of hard work. Michel got off his horse and tied the reins to the fence post. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with every step. The leather of his hat was faded by the sun, and his work pants had patches that told stories of difficult days. He was not a man made for arranged marriages. He was a man made for open fields and wild cattle. The door opened before he could knock. Martha Hensley appeared on the threshold. Brown hair tied in a simple bun, navy blue dress without embellishments, and eyes that seemed to appreciate everything around. She was taller than he expected, with straight shoulders and hands that showed calluses from work. It was not a beauty in the sense that men used to talk about, but there was something about her that demanded respect. Martha watched him in silence for a long moment. Her eyes ran over his face, his calloused hands, his boots worn. She was doing the same calculation as him, evaluating whether it could work. Wordless, she walked away from the door and gestured for him to come in. The house inside was even more impressive. Solid hardwood furniture, rugs that came from far away, and photographs on the walls that showed a grey-bearded man next to a younger Martha. Her late husband, Michel, imagined, a man who had built something lasting. Martha led him into the living room and pointed to a brown leather armchair. She settled on the couch herself, keeping her posture upright. He took some papers from a nearby drawer and placed them on the coffee table. Contracts, documents, the formalization of the agreement that would change the lives of both. Michel took off his hat and held it with both hands. He knew what those papers meant. It was not a marriage for love. It was a business. She needed help running the farm. He needed to save his family from ruin. It was a fair exchange, although it carried the weight of obligation. Martha pointed to the documents and then to him. The farm had 300 head of cattle, 15 working horses, and land that extended to the river. It was a lot for one woman alone to manage. Michel understood without her having to explain. His parents had told him about his experience with cattle, about the years working with animals since he was a boy. She folded her hands over his lap and watched him carefully. The deal was more generous than he expected. In exchange for helping to run the farm, his family would be free of debt. In addition, he would have a roof over his head, food, and a share of the profits. It was more than his family deserved, considering the circumstances. Michel twirled his hat between his fingers. He could feel the weight of the moment. Martha pointed to the stairs leading to the second floor and then to a room on the ground floor. The message was clear. Everyone would have their space. They were adults. They could keep it civil. Silence settled between them. Michel could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock on the wall, the distant mooing of cattle, the creaking of the wood of the house in the heat of the day. It was a silence full of uncertain future. Martha picked up a pen and pointed to a date on the calendar on the table. Saturday of the following week. Reverend Matthews could see them after the service. 5 days. In 5 days, his life would change completely. Michel stood up, putting his hat back on his head. He took the pen and signed the papers. Martha did the same. A deal sealed without words, with only the ink that was drying on the paper. Martha stood up and held out her hand to him, a firm handshake as if sealing a cattle deal. There were no smiles. There were no promises of happiness. There was only the mutual understanding of 2 people doing what was necessary to survive. Michel left the house with the sun already declining on the horizon. The wind had died down and the air was fresher. He mounted the bay horse and looked one last time at the house that would soon be his, too. The windows reflected the golden light of the evening, and for a moment they looked like eyes watching his departure. As he rode back into town, Michel thought about what he had just accepted. It wasn't love, nor passion. It was survival disguised as marriage. But perhaps in the Wild West, that was as close to happiness as a man like him could hope for. Fate sometimes arrives disguised as debt, and sometimes, just sometimes, he brings with him a second chance. poor Cowboy was forced to marry an older widow. Part 2. Saturday arrived with the same relentless sun as always. Michael adjusted his tie for the third time in front of the hotel's fogged mirror. It was the only tie he owned, inherited from his father along with the brown suit that smelled of mothballs. His hands trembled slightly, not from the morning chill, but from the weight of what was about to happen. In an hour, he would be married to a woman he barely knew, sealing a fate he had not chosen. The Methodist church at Cedar Falls was small and simple. Light wood pews, simple stained glass windows that filtered the golden light of the morning, and the smell of beeswax that someone had used to polish the altar. Michel arrived first, as agreed. He waited standing next to Reverend Matthews, a thin, white-haired man who watched him with silent compassion. Martha entered punctually at 10 o'clock. She wore a dark grey dress without a veil or flowers. Nothing at that moment suggested celebration. She walked down the central aisle with steady steps, holding a small Bible in her hands. Her eyes met Michel's only once, in a look that revealed neither joy nor grief. It was the look of someone fulfilling a necessary task. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. The Reverend Matthews recited the traditional words about love, honor, and fidelity, but his voice carried the solemn tone of someone who knew this was no ordinary marriage. Michel repeated the vows without conviction, feeling each word like a stone in his throat. Martha did the same, her voice clear and steady, as if reading a shopping list. When it was time to kiss the bride, Martha just lightly touched his hand. It was enough. The Reverend uttered the final words, and they were married. Mr. and Mrs. Michael Santos, united before God and the law, separated by everything else. The journey to the farm was made in silence. Michael drove the borrowed wagon, Martha by his side observing the landscape he knew by heart. The wind shook her loose hair for the first time since they met, and Michael noticed some grey strands she always kept hidden in the bun. It was a reminder that she had lived longer, lost more, knew more about life than he did. The house received them with the same grandeur as always, but now it had a different meaning for Michel. It was officially his home, your responsibility, your burden. Martha got off the wagon without waiting for help and walked directly to the porch. She stopped in front of the door and turned to him as if she expected him to take some initiative. Michel carried the few possessions he had brought, a worn leather suitcase, his favorite saddle, and a yellowed photograph of his parents in better times. Martha watched him silently and then pointed to the downstairs bedroom. The rules were established from day one, each one in their own space. Dinner was served at the large kitchen table. Martha had prepared roast beef with potatoes and beans. The food was tasty, but they ate in almost absolute silence. Only the clatter of cutlery against the plates and the occasional mooing of cattle outside broke the stillness. Michael tried to make some comments about the weather and the cattle, but Martha responded with nods or simple gestures. When it got dark, she got up and started picking up the dishes. Michel offered to help, but she shook her head negatively. It was evident that she had her routines, her methods, her way of doing things. He was an outsider trying to fit into an already established life. Martha finished washing the dishes and dried her hands on her apron. She looked at Michel for a long moment, as if she were evaluating something important. Then he walked to the stairs that led to the second floor. He stopped at the first step and turned to him once more. Their eyes clearly said that their wedding night would be like everything else between them, practical, without romanticism, without illusions. Michael got the message and nodded. Martha climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the silent house. He waited until he heard the bedroom door close upstairs. Then he walked to his own room on the ground floor. The room was simple but comfortable. A single bed with a blue bedspread, a dark wood chest of drawers, and a window that overlooked the corral. Michel took off his suit and hung it carefully. It was likely that he would not need it again for long. He lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Upstairs, he could hear Martha moving around the room getting ready for bed, the sound of his footsteps, the creaking of the floorboards, the opening and closing of drawers. They were the sounds of a woman following her nightly routine, a routine that didn't include him. Through the window, the moon dimly illuminated the pasture where the cattle rested. Michel thought about how his life had changed in a matter of hours. In the morning, he was single, free to leave whenever he wanted. Now he was a married man with responsibilities and commitments. He had a farm to help manage, a wife to meet, a future to build. The sound of a key turning in the lock came from upstairs. Martha had locked the door to her room. The message was clear. Even married, they would still be strangers, at least for now. Michel closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Outside, an owl chirped in the darkness, and the wind swayed the curtains of his window. His first night of marriage ended as it had begun, in silence, loneliness, and uncertainty. But in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, with time and patience, that arrangement could turn into something more. Perhaps Martha was also hearing the same voice, locked in her room, looking out the window and wondering what kind of man she had brought into her home. Poor Cowboy was forced to marry an older widow. Part 3. The following days unfolded like pages of an already written book. Michel woke up before dawn, as he had always done. Martha was already in the kitchen, preparing coffee and toast. She placed his cup on the table without looking into his eyes, as if it were an automatic ritual. He thanked him with a nod and went out to tend the cattle. This is how their mornings began. Two people sharing the same space without really meeting. The work on the farm was harder than Michel had imagined. Martha held herself to a high standard. The cattle were always well cared for, the fences always in perfect condition, the horses always healthy and strong. It was evident that her late husband had built something solid, and she would not allow any of it to deteriorate. Michel respected this dedication, even if it meant long days under the scorching sun. During the first few weeks, they communicated mainly through gestures and looks. Martha pointed to a fence that needed repair. Michel waved and took the tools. It indicated which horse needed new shoes. He took the animal to the city. It was a silent dance of efficiency but also of distance. One morning, Michel noticed that one of the cows was having difficulty calving. The animal moaned softly, lying in the shade of a lonely tree in the pasture. Michel tried to help alone for almost an hour, but the situation became complicated. The calf was badly positioned, and the cow was losing strength. Martha appeared out of nowhere, carrying a basin of warm water and some clean cloths. She knelt next to Michel without saying a word and dipped her hands in the water. Together, they worked to reposition the calf. Her hands were deft and safe, guiding Michel's when necessary. For almost 2 hours, they fought to save mother and calf. When the calf was finally born, healthy and breathing, Martha sat on the grass next to Michel. Both were dirty with dirt and blood, exhausted from the effort. For the first time since their marriage, she looked him straight in the eye. He didn't say anything, but Michel saw something different in that look. Recognition, respect, maybe even gratitude. That night, for the first time, she prepared a dessert, apple pie with cinnamon, served while still warm. Michel complimented the taste with a genuine smile, and Martha almost smiled back. Almost. It was a small but significant progress. The weeks turned into months. The heat of summer gave way to milder autumn. Michel began to understand the rhythms of the farm, the peculiarities of each animal, the secrets that Martha kept about cattle breeding. She, in turn, began to trust his work more. It let him make small decisions, such as choosing which horses to use for certain tasks. One afternoon, while repairing a broken fence, Michel heard Martha humming in the kitchen. It was a low melody, almost a murmur, but it was the first time I had heard her make any sound that was not strictly necessary. He stopped work and listened, trying to identify the song. It was a sad song, about lost love and loneliness, but her voice had an unexpected sweetness. That same week, Michel brought some wildflowers he found near the stream. He left them in a makeshift vase on the kitchen table, without explanation. Martha found them when she returned from feeding the chickens. She touched the petals gently, as if they were made of glass. He said nothing, but he did not throw them away. They remained on the table for a whole week until they withered. The first real sign of change came during an October storm. The wind howled around the house, and the rain pounded against the windows hard. Michel was lying in his room when he heard a strange noise coming from upstairs. It was a low, almost imperceptible sound. Martha was crying. He stood up and stood at the foot of the stairs, torn between climbing to console her and respecting her privacy. The sound continued for several minutes, a suppressed, silent cry that spoke of a deep, long-standing pain. Michel understood that it wasn't just the storm that scared her. It was loneliness, memories, the weight of carrying a farm, and a lifetime alone. The next morning, Martha went down to the cafe with slightly swollen eyes. Michel pretended not to notice, but left an extra strong cup of coffee waiting for her. During the day, he worked closer to the house, always within earshot in case she needed anything. It was her silent way of saying that she wasn't completely alone. Gradually, small gestures began to replace total silence. Martha began to prepare his favorite meals, discovering his preferences through observation. Michelle began to bring extra wood for the fireplace on the colder nights. They still kept separate rooms. They still avoided long conversations, but a subtle form of mutual care was being born. One night, Michelle found an extra blanket folded over his bed. Martha had noticed that he woke up taking it out on the coldest mornings. He smiled alone in the dark, understanding that this small gesture meant more than 1,000 words. Autumn was ending, and with it, the first phase of their arranged marriage. They were still strangers in many ways. They still kept their secrets and their fears, but something was changing. It was subtle, like the changing of the seasons, but it was real. Michelle began to realize that Martha was not just a practical widow who needed help on the farm. She was a woman who had loved deeply, lost so much, and now she was trying to rebuild her life with the pieces that remained. And maybe, just maybe, he could be part of that reconstruction. With each passing day, the idea of leaving the farm became more distant, not just because the agreement forced him to stay, but because something inside him was beginning to take root in that barren land. Roots that grew slowly, but with the silent force of desert plants. Danger always comes when you least expect it. Michael was repairing the well pump when he saw the dust on the horizon. 3 riders were approaching at moderate speed, but there was something about their posture that made him alert. They were not ordinary travelers. The way they surveyed the property, the way their eyes scanned every detail of the house and the corrals, suggested intentions that went beyond a cordial visit. Martha was in the chicken coop collecting eggs when Michelle called out to her with a low whistle. She looked up and followed his gaze toward the knights. His expression hardened immediately. She knew that kind of man. She had seen others like her in the difficult years after the death of her first husband. The 3 men stopped their horses near the porch. The leader was a thin fellow with scars on his face and a faded black hat. The other 2 looked younger, but their eyes had the same calculating coldness. They dismounted unhurriedly, tied up the horses, and walked towards the house as if they were the owners of the place. Michel approached slowly, keeping his hands visible but close to the revolver in his holster. Martha stepped out of the coop and stood beside him, holding the basket of eggs with unnecessary tightness. They did not need to exchange words to understand that they were facing a dangerous situation. The bandit leader took off his hat and bowed exaggeratedly and sarcastically. His voice had the honeyed tone of someone who was used to getting what he wanted, through intimidation, disguised as courtesy. He explained that he represented certain interests in the region, that the farm was in a very valuable location, and that it would be a shame if something bad happened to such a beautiful property. Michel felt the tension rise in his chest. He knew that kind of extortion. The crooks wanted regular money in exchange for protection from themselves. It was an old game, but an effective one. Martha remained silent, but Michel could feel her anger growing next to him. The bandit continued talking about the dangers of life in the isolated countryside. Mysterious fires, cattle that disappeared during the night, unfortunate accidents that could happen to people who did not have the proper protection. His words were carefully chosen to sound like genuine concern, but the threat was crystal clear. Michael took a step forward. His voice came out calm, but firm. He thanked the visitors for their concern, but explained that the farm was well protected and that they did not need outside help. The bandit leader smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. He looked around once more, as if he was memorizing every detail for future use. The 3 men mounted their horses unhurriedly. Before leaving, the leader made a point of mentioning that they would return in a week for a definitive answer on the protection proposal. They set off slowly, but Michel noticed that one of them looked back several times, clearly studying the defenses of the property. As soon as the bandits disappeared over the horizon, Martha released the basket of eggs. They scattered on the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. For the first time since they met, she held Michel's arm. It was not a romantic gesture, but of a person who recognized that he had found an ally at a crucial moment. That night, they sat down at the kitchen table and actually talked for the first time. Martha told about other attempts at intimidation she had faced alone in previous years. Some neighboring farmers had given in to the demands and now paid regular tribute to the bandits. Others who resisted had cattle stolen, barns set on fire, or worse. Michel listened in silence, better understanding the challenges Martha had faced as a single woman at the helm of a thriving farm. It was not only the management of cattle and land that worried her. It was the constant need to show strength when she felt vulnerable. They spent the next few hours planning the defense of the property. Michel knew the tactics of the bandits from his own experience. They would probably return during the night, when they believed they had the upper hand. The house was well positioned, with good visibility of the surroundings, but they would need to be prepared for a siege. Martha showed where her first husband kept his weapons. He had 3 Winchester rifles, a pair of handguns, and enough ammunition for a prolonged battle. She herself knew how to shoot, having learned out of necessity in the early years of her widowhood. Michel was impressed with her accuracy when they tested the weapons in the backyard. Over the next few days, they turned the farm into a makeshift fortress. They moved furniture to barricade windows, established firing positions with good cover, and created escape routes in case the situation became untenable. They worked side by side, united by a common goal for the first time. On the 5th night after the bandits' visit, they came. Michel was making the rounds when he saw the silhouettes moving between the trees near the stream. There were more than 3 now, at least 6 men, possibly more. They had brought in reinforcements, which meant they were serious about the resistance. Michel ran back to the house and woke Martha with a gentle tap on the shoulder. She stood up immediately, completely alert. There was no panic or hesitation. They both knew that moment would come and they were ready. They took their positions, Michel at the window of the living room that faced the front of the house, Martha in the kitchen overlooking the back. The bandits approached slowly, trying to surround the property, but Michel and Martha had the advantage of knowing every rock, every tree, every shade around their house. The first shot came from the bandits, hitting the outer wall near Michel's window. It was the sign they were waiting for. The real battle for the farm was beginning, and this time Martha would not fight alone. In the dark of night, united against a common enemy, Michel and Martha discovered that they had something stronger than a marriage contract. They had mutual trust and the determination to protect what was theirs. The battle lasted until dawn. Michel and Martha fought like 2 experienced soldiers, anticipating each other's movements without needing words. When the bandits tried to surround the house from the east side, Martha shouted a warning and Michel redirected his shots. When one of the invaders managed to get close to the kitchen, Michel created a distraction in front, while Martha surprised him from behind. The bandits had underestimated the duo. They expected to find a frightened widow and an inexperienced cowboy. Instead, they faced 2 determined defenders who knew every inch of their property and fought for something that really mattered to them. As the night wore on, it became clear that the attackers were losing their advantage. 2 of them had already been wounded by Martha's well-aimed shots. Another had retreated after Michel got a graze shot in his shoulder. The leader shouted increasingly desperate orders, realizing that his simple plan of intimidation had turned into a real battle. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky in orange tones, only 3 bandits still resisted. They were entrenched behind the corral, but their position was becoming untenable. Their ammunition was running low, and they knew that other farmers might have heard the shots and come to investigate. Michel had an idea. He waved at Martha and pointed to the back door. She understood immediately. While he kept the bandits busy with gunfire from the front of the house, she quietly exited through the back and managed to outflank them. In a matter of minutes, the remaining 3 men were surrounded, with Martha pointing her rifle at them on one side and Michel on the other. The leader tried to negotiate, offering to leave and never return. Michel shook his head negatively. They had gone too far, done too much damage. It was time to face the consequences of his actions. He ordered them to throw their weapons on the ground and raise their hands. Martha found ropes in the barn, and they tied up the 6 captured bandits. 2 were injured, but nothing that put their lives at immediate risk. Michel saddled 2 horses, while Martha prepared provisions for the trip to the city. They would take the criminals to Sheriff Palmer, who had long been looking for this gang. The ride to Cedar Falls took the entire morning. The tied bandits walked in a row, their hands tied to the saddles of the horses. Michel and Martha rode alongside, vigilant and ready to react to any attempt to escape. But the men seemed defeated, aware that their chances of escape had run out. Sheriff Palmer received the delivery with surprise and admiration. For months he had been trying to capture this gang that terrorized farmers in 3 counties. Seeing Michel and Martha bringing them all tied up and defeated was more than he had dared to expect. He promised that the men would face full justice, including charges of extortion, trespassing, and attempted robbery. During the trip back to the farm, something had changed between Michel and Martha. They were no longer strangers fulfilling a trade agreement. They were partners who had faced danger together and emerged victorious. They had saved not only their property, but also their dignity and independence. That night, for the first time since their marriage, they dined like a real couple. Martha had prepared a feast with all the best she had in the pantry. They talked about the day's events, about plans for the farm, about how to improve defenses in case other problems arose. But mostly, they talked like two people who finally knew and respected each other. After dinner, Martha did not immediately go upstairs to her room. She sat in the living room with Michelle, watching the flames of the fireplace. The silence between them was now comfortable, no longer fraught with tension or distrust. It was the silence of two people who had found peace in each other's company. When Martha finally got up to go to sleep, she stopped in front of Michelle. For a moment it seemed like he was going to say something important. Instead, it lightly touched his face, where a bullet scratch had left a superficial mark. It was a soft touch, full of gratitude and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. The following weeks brought a new routine. Michael and Martha worked side by side during the day, no longer as mistress and employee, but as true partners. They made decisions together, divided responsibilities according to their abilities, and began to make plans for the future of the farm. One morning, Michelle noticed that Martha looked different. She was paler than usual and had refused breakfast, something she never did. During the day, he saw her lean several times on the fences, as if she were dizzy. When he asked if she was okay, Martha smiled in a mysterious way and said it was just tiredness. But Michelle knew Martha too well now to accept that explanation. There was something in his eyes, a new light that wasn't there before. Something had changed in her, and he suspected what it could be. A week later, Martha invited him to sit on the porch at dusk. She held his hands between hers and looked him straight in the eyes. Then, in the same calm voice she used to talk about farm business, she told her she was expecting a child. Michelle was silent for a long moment, absorbing the news. A son, something he had always wanted but never expected to have, especially not like this, not with a woman he had met through a business deal. Martha watched his reaction anxiously, not knowing if he would be happy or worried about the news. When Michel finally spoke, his voice was charged with emotion. He said he couldn't imagine a better gift, that the idea of being a father was something he had always dreamed of. Martha smiled, and for the first time since they met, it was a completely genuine and joyful smile. That night, for the first time, Michelle went up the stairs. Martha didn't lock the bedroom door. They finally became husband and wife in the full sense of the words, not by obligation or business arrangement, but by choice and by love that had grown slowly and quietly between them. Months later, when the baby was born, Michel held his son in his arms and looked at Martha with infinite gratitude. What had begun as a marriage forced by circumstance had grown into the family they had both always wanted, but never believed they could have. Fate sometimes arrives disguised as debt, but sometimes, if we have enough patience and courage, it reveals itself as the greatest blessing of our lives. Michel and Martha learned that true love doesn't always come like lightning. Sometimes it grows slowly, like hardy desert plants, growing deep roots that can survive any storm. If this story of courage and survival has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West. Subscribe to the channel to follow more narratives about intertwined destinies, loves that are born from the most difficult circumstances, and the strength of being human when facing the challenges of wildlife. Leave your comment below telling what was the most emotional moment of this story for you. Was it when Michel and Martha fought side by side against the bad guys, when she revealed the pregnancy, or maybe that first night when she locked the bedroom door? Their stories and opinions inspire us to create more and more exciting adventures set in the vast deserts and small towns of the Wild West, where every choice can change the course of a life forever.